Roby 1 returning. I'm going to sit here eating some peanuts because I'm going to return to another part of the Underground Railroad of Uxbridge, Mass. And how very well it's presented. And also how I am very speculative of some of the things behind it. But nevertheless, let us proceed.
Herself, if I do not like to stay, I can go away, as if she would learn it. She should not go anywhere to please me. I love her and I will do anything I can for her. But she is free. And that's everything we know about Susan. Just that one little glimpse. So she was here, she worked with a teacher here, and we believe that she went on to Worcester from here. So another important value for the Society of Friends was education. And this is at a time when teaching enslaved people to read and write was a crime. So many of the young women from the Uxbridge monthly meeting here at the Friends Meeting House went to a school in Providence, and there was a gentleman who was running the school. His name was Moses Brown. Any of you guys heard of Brown University? Same guy. Okay. So he had what was called a boarding school. And these young ladies, it catered to both young women and men, boys and girls. They would study down there, and many of the young women became teachers. So 3 here in Uxbridge that we know about: Rebecca Buffum, her sister Lydia Buffum, and another young lady who was from Uxbridge named Abbie Kelly. Now, Abbie Kelly becomes a rock star in the anti-slavery movement. If you go to Worcester, you go to Mechanics Hall, there is a portrait of her in Mechanics Hall. Worcester is currently building a statue to Abbie Kelly in Worcester. Worcester doesn't know, if you read about it, they say that she grew up somewhere in the country. It was here. Her mother's family, their name were Daniels, and so they grew up on one of the Daniels farms here in Uxbridge. And she lived in Uxbridge until she was about 11 years old, and then she went to the boarding school down in Providence. She wasn't as wealthy as the Buffums. She had to kind of put herself through school. So the way she did that is she would attend for a year, and then she would teach for a year, and then she went back and she would attend for a year. And she did that until she completed her studies in Providence. She became a teacher up in Lynn, and then she became, like I said, an absolute rock star in the anti-slavery movement. She was the national fundraising leader, and she was a speaker, and she came to Uxbridge many times. This was controversial at the time. First off, women really weren't allowed to speak. You could sometimes speak if it was just other women, but if men were in the room, it was considered utterly controversial. And she wasn't having it. She was having none of that. Eventually, she actually left the Society of Friends. There's some different stories about how she left, but essentially, she felt that it was important that these anti-slavery speeches be given, that the local churches here in Uxbridge should support that, including the Society of Friends. And the Society of Friends was not totally comfortable with her passion and her agitation. They didn't really consider it to comport with their values so much. They didn't kick her out. Eventually she was written out of the meeting, which is kind of their version of excommunication, but it was because she asked to leave. She felt that it was no longer really working for her. She's a really interesting lady and grew up here in Uxbridge. So one more photo, a photo from the 1880s. This is the Wheelock School, which is, if you know where the little park is on 16 as you come in, if you walk around that park, there's a foundation right under the grass. You can just see the stones. That was the Wheelock School. And in the 1880s, we have a photo from the children in the class at the Wheelock School. And if you look really closely, we have black children, white children, Native American children in an Uxbridge school in the 1880s. This is 140 years before Brown was a Board of Education. So those early values stayed in Uxbridge for a very, very long time. So, a powerful spark. So young Rebecca Buffum, she's about 16 years old when she starts teaching. She stays in Uxbridge for about 5 years. And she's staying with her cousin, Lydia. Remember Lydia? Now Lydia has gotten married, and she has married somebody called Effingham L. Capron. Effingham becomes another really big deal in the anti-slavery society. Now, Effingham was kind of the gradual emancipation colonist persuasion until he met young Rebecca. And Rebecca, and had a record from, as it turns out, Abby Kelly Foster, was kind of a little evangelical with the guy. They were saying, no, this isn't right, you need to look at this. And he went up to Boston, he met with William Lloyd Garrison, who was the founder of the anti-slavery movement, and he became a passionate anti-slavery person. And he also became a station master. He was very important in moving people north. We know this for certain because there is a letter from another station master in Brooklyn, Connecticut, whose name was Samuel L. May. And May is a name you might know. Anybody ever read Little Women? Louisa May Alcott? That May is her uncle. Okay, so her uncle's down in Brooklyn. He's bringing people to Uxbridge, to Effingham L. Capron, here in Uxbridge. So, in time, Effingham L. Capron, it's quite a name. I really wish I knew if he had a nickname. I don't think like F or L or, you know. This is a man who needs a nickname. But he became the vice president of the American Anti-Slavery Society, the National Anti-Slavery Society. And he shows up all over the place. He worked for the rest of his life to end slavery. So another thing that he did, he became a state rep. And he was not afraid to use his power. I have this much power as a selectman, right there. Okay, he had a little real power. He was up at the State House, and there was a young man from Uxbridge, his name was Sullivan Anthony. He was blind, and they wanted to get him into the House School, which eventually became the Perkins School up in Boston. And the headmaster there was not really fond of this idea. And they had had another child who was African American, and they said, well, she's too young. But when they talked to him a little bit later, he says, well, my patrons probably wouldn't like it. You know, he didn't want to rock the boat. When Anthony was enrolled in this school, he said that Southern parents wouldn't really care for this. He didn't want to irritate them. So Effingham Capron at the State House told the headmaster that he would pull his money if he didn't let this kid in. And the headmaster saw the light, as headmasters will, and he was enrolled. And for the next 3 years, Effingham Capron kept a pretty close eye on this kid to see how he was doing. So, his wife, Lydia, remember Lydia? She became the first president of the Uxbridge Female Anti-Slavery Society. And then we have one more glimpse of Rebecca. There was a gentleman by the name of John Brown, who was a radical and a little bit of a violent person. And he tried to launch a slave assault in a place called Harper's Ferry. It didn't go well. He was imprisoned. He was eventually executed. But Rebecca Buffum left this area and went down to New Jersey. Went down to Virginia. And she met with John Brown before he was executed. And they made arrangements to bring 2 of his raiders, who were also executed, bring their bodies back to her farm, which was a big deal. At that time, they didn't treat the bodies very well. Some were given to medical operations, and some of them were just shot up because they were very mad about it. So this was just something she did for their families, was to bring those bodies back. There was a World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840, and someone from Vermont said the women there were among the primeval abolitionists and had been merely seconded by their husbands. So you need to understand this was a history which had lots of aspects to it. So I want to show you a couple of places here in Uxbridge where these things happened. Okay? Capron Park, you know where the waterfall is as you come through 16, right there. That pond was built by John Capron, and that was the area where the 3 Capron brothers, Effingham and his 2 brothers, owned the mills and operated in those areas right there. That's now called Capron Park. It's a state park, and through the good efforts of Peter Emmerich, it was dedicated to the memory of Effingham Capron of Uxbridge.
Isn't that pretty?
There was a real controversy, I'm going to go a little faster through this, about cotton versus wool. The mills were up here, and the economy of the North actually depended a lot on Southern goods. So if it was a cotton mill, that cotton was probably coming from the south, at least after the 1830s or 40s. In Uxbridge, most of the mills were actually woolen mills. They made woolen yarn, but there were some that were cotton mills, and there were some that made fabric, which had both wool and cotton in it. The Caper Mill, as it happens, was a mill that used both wool and cotton. It was a fabric called satinette. Shipping is a big thing for the North. That continued during the times of slavery. So even when slavery was illegal in the North, northern ships would travel south and pick up goods, and sometimes pick up slaves. It was a big boom time for sheep herders. Actually, up here in the North, when you have wool, wool was a local product largely up until the coming of the railroad, 1850s, about. So one of the things you need for sheep is actually stone walls. So all those little stone walls going back into the woods, a lot of those were sheep pens, supporting the wool industry here. So the Caper Mill, it made satinette, it made the fabric that had both cotton and wool threads. So there's some, concern that this person who's a really strong abolitionist was also making his living a little bit off of southern cotton. We talked about the free produce, the free labor movements. They did actually manage to set up a cotton mill in Pennsylvania, which did not use cotton from the South, but I don't think it was a widespread practice. Okay. So satinette was used in men's trousers. It was used in military uniforms. So the new military uniforms that were made for the Civil War were made with this fabric. We do know that in 1845, Effingham Caper sold out most of his interests in Uxbridge, and he moved to Worcester, and he bought a mill there, which made broadcloth. And broadcloth was an all-wool product. So I don't know if that was intentional or if it was just a business decision, but that's the facts that we have, is that eventually he was no longer involved in this business.